how do we make operations teams successful in a franchise system? So what do we mean by the operations teams, or which were the parts of the organization we're looking at, right? So on the operations team, we looked at two different parts of it, and you'll see why we looked at it. There was the chief operating officer, or the head of operations, the traditional operations, but we also have the general counsel. And in many organizations, they work very closely together. And sometimes they are separated. But the point is that what we are seeing, that operations, your core unit operations, as well as your compliance and all of your agreement tracking, these don't happen independent of one another. They're very closely linked with one another. And then in the operations function, we have different specific roles. So we have the director of operations, who's responsible for, for improving unit level performance. We have director of training, who's responsible for training and onboarding, and so on and so forth. But what is important about it, and of course we have the field consultant who's responsible for coaching the franchisees. But what we found that was really important, and I'll get into the imperatives, is that your operations, your training, and your coaching of your franchisees, that system, all of the data, all of the workflows need to be linked together, because the context is really important. So even if you have the best training system in place, unless you tie that training to the coaching of your franchisees, to the operations, so the results that you're seeing, you're not going to get the same results as you would have had you treated this as one holistic system. And of course, on the general counsel side, what we are seeing is that because there's so much compliance and agreement tracking, and there's complex entity structures and ownership structures in franchising, that a lot of the franchise administration and a lot of the the contracts and agreements, they tie into operations. So when we talk about the operations team, we're talking about all of these people. And you could have, in some organizations, one person wears multiple hats, and on other organizations, a director of operations could be a team by itself, right? So irrespective of how many people you have and how you've divided the labor, the point here is, how do you make all of them work together? And what we're seeing evolving is beyond just the core operations functions. You'll see that the head of operations is also now helping with recruiting and onboarding and everything else, right? So if you get into the 4 imperatives, right? So the next slide. The first imperative is really operational excellence. And what operational excellence gets to, so if you looked at some of the slides or the data that Ian shared, is this is the core of operations. Ensuring consistency and quality of your service, brand compliance, field execution. These are things that most brands have been doing, and this is what operations does. We think of them as table stakes. But when we talk about excellence, what we're talking about are 3 things. The first is how efficient can you make the system, right? When we talk about scaling the organization, we're talking about efficiency. Can you make the system as efficient as possible? The second part that we're talking about when we talk about excellence is that you shouldn't have gaps in your processes or workflows between field execution, compliance, and all of the activities that you do in terms of ensuring consistency and quality of service at your unit level, right? So the second part is that these workflows need to be all connected. And the third part is that you need to be collecting data, because all of these activities at the end of the day is collecting data for your business. And using that data, which we'll show you in the demonstration that Nick will show you, is where the real power comes from. So taking things that are table stakes and leveraging that to your advantage is what operational excellence is. And you can do this relatively easily. So once you've achieved, or once you're on the path of operational excellence, which is you're as efficient, you've automated, you're collecting the data, the next part is that you can now start using this information directly to improve unit performance. That's something that we will show you in the product itself. In fact, a lot of brands that I saw, when we were looking at the data, is that looking at the analysis that we did last when we talked to them, we realized was that they were not really using that data to drive unit performance. They had all this data, they had it. Like many organizations, when I first speak to them, brands, they would say, we don't have this data. We need to create a data warehouse or whatever, all those things. And I'd be like, you already have it. In fact, you already have these KPIs and these metrics. They're just disconnected and they're in different areas, but you can operationalize just the data that you have. But the next thing is data on itself is not sufficient. What you have to do is take the data and then operationalize them through what we call as playbooks. Playbooks are things that you can do to improve performance of the units. as well as if you're seeing things that are not working, you can use playbooks, which are best practices, to improve or take corrective actions as needed. So the second imperative is that taking your data and operationalizing it, and operationalizing data really means taking your best practices and creating playbooks out of it, right? So that was the second imperative of operations is, once you have the table stakes, running, taking that and focusing on unit performance, because that's what makes successful brands successful. The third one, if you go from there, is in franchisee engagement. Often, historically, franchisee engagement hasn't really been treated. It's been treated as a function on its own. I need to create a portal. I need to be able to send messages. I need to have some communication. I need to be able to assign tasks. But that's not what engagement is, right? What engagement really is at the end of the day, it consists of three things: communication, which is a bi-directional communication with your franchisee, but communication for the purpose, not just for informing, but also to engage so that they do the right thing, right? So, and the third thing is, once you've engaged, being able to onboard and train your owners and their staff to be successful, right? The context is really important. Why does this fall under operations? Because nothing that you do for unit performance improvement plans, any of the things which you saw in the second imperative, using your data, leveraging your data, creating these playbooks, will succeed without the engagement of your franchisees. And what you have to do, again, just like for the other imperatives, is that the engagement has to come naturally. So at FranConnect, one of the biggest changes we had to do in the product, and what I think was one of our biggest challenges, was how do you take things that were previously separate functions within the product and tie them so that they appeared seamless from your chief operating officer and your legal counsel on the one end on the corporate level, and your single unit operator or large multi-unit owners, franchisees on the other end, so that you're driving all of the unit performance and all of your initiatives that you want to achieve. And Nick will touch on this, in about the 20-25 minutes in his demo, but I'm happy to go through and explain this in more detail, because this has been a big part of the product investment that we did, and was based off of learning that we had from our customers. And finally, the fourth imperative, which is really important, is around compliance. And when we talk about compliance here, it's not just about doing a store audit and making sure whether that unit or unit audit, making sure that that unit is in compliance with certain rules and regulations, or with how they roll out, how they're servicing their customers. But compliance actually goes far beyond that. And what we're talking about compliance here is really based on the idea that any franchise owner, or when you have any system, franchise system, is made up of these agreements that are signed, right? And enforcement of these agreements, or ensuring that these agreements are met throughout the entire life cycle, is really part of the compliance, right? Store audit is only part of the process. There's also compliance that the brand has to external markets. So we are actually seeing, in many cases, state or national regulations being either applied or in the process of being applied. And those organizations in the franchise industry that are the best prepared for it and they can manage to compliance are the ones that will be successful. And one of the things with compliance is you want to achieve compliance with the lowest cost, right? Because being compliant doesn't lead to additional revenue. So how do you do that in the most efficient way? Is you have a single source of truth. Again, that data layer that is a single source of truth that you can use for compliance, for operations and engagement, really is the holy grail, right?